Welcome to the Shepherd Podcast. I'm your host. I'm Pastor Chris. It's great to be with you today. The podcast has been a wonderful way to help you get to know some people here at Shepherd, our church, school, and child care, and also to explore some relevant issues and how those things relate to our faith as Christians. After some discussion and thought, our director, producer, Melody, and I have decided to wrap up the podcast. This is our 90th episode. We've covered a lot of ground, and we feel that the podcast has accomplished its purpose. During the pandemic, it allowed us to get to know each other even when we couldn't be together personally as a congregation. Now that a lot of things are happening again in person, we felt that it's time to move forward into some other things, like exploring more opportunities with member calls, guest follow-up, community outreach, things like that, where we can personally be involved with people in their lives. And so while we have enjoyed the podcast, we feel like it's time to move forward into some new things. Having said that, this has been one of my favorite ministries. I have enjoyed this so much. Getting to sit across from people here at Shepherd, to hear their stories, to talk about things. Frankly, I would love to just sit down and talk with every member, every school family, and get to hear their stories. Everybody has a story. And through the podcast, you've been able to benefit from hearing those stories as well. So I want to thank you very much for your viewership. And today and next week, our final two episodes, Melody and I decided to do something special. We're going to revisit some of our more memorable episodes over these past couple of years. Today's episode will look at some of our first 20 episodes, just a few of them, give you some highlights. You might see that we've come a long way in terms of the quality of the production, the camera, the audio, those kinds of things, the background. And so we're going to go back to the early days of the podcast, which wasn't all that long ago, just a couple years. But a lot has happened in that time in our world and at Shepherd. So these might be a review for you, or maybe some of these you'll be seeing for the first time, but I hope you'll enjoy looking back on some of our early episodes. On page 42 of this book, it says, "The coronavirus was sent, therefore, by God. It is a bitter season, and God ordained it." What are your thoughts on that sentence? The coronavirus was sent, therefore, by God.
For me, the hard part about that statement is it implies that everything that happens comes from God. And if you take that to its full extent, if everything that happens comes from God, then ultimately, every time I sin, that comes from God, because everything that happens comes from God. The church shooting in Sutherland Springs, did that come from God? If everything comes from God, then all the church shootings, Mother Emanuel in Georgia, all the church shootings come from God. And that's very hard for me to accept. I believe there is a thing called free will. I believe there is a thing called natural order of creation. I believe that God is sovereign, but I do not believe that church shootings come from God. I do not believe that it is possible for us to categorically declare about anything that it comes from God outside of God's mercy and grace. Undeniably, God's mercy and grace comes from Him. Is it possible the coronavirus came from God? Of course. Is it possible that it's just a manifestation of sin in our world, of the brokenness of our world, that it came from Satan, like in the suffering of Job? God allowed Satan to act, but it was Satan who did the bad things in Job's life.
It's interesting you bring up Satan and Job, because right after that statement, he quotes from Job 1. And you hadn't read that part, it just sort of flowed. And the quote here is, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So, you use this passage to suggest that this could come from Satan and not from God. And he's using the same passage to talk about the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. How can two people come at the same passage from two different directions?
That's the marvel of biblical interpretation. There's only one Bible, but there's as many interpretations as there are Bible scholars.
Yeah.
I believe the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, absolutely. But in between that was the work of the devil, was Satan's work.
Yeah. Okay, so the sentence was, "The coronavirus was sent therefore by God." If you were the editor, how would you revise that sentence to reflect more your theological understanding?
If I was the editor, it would be easy to argue that the coronavirus was sent by God. And then I would encourage the author to look for historical precedent, particularly biblical precedent. We know from what the Bible tells us that the flood was sent by God. We know that the Exodus was sent by God. The plagues were sent by God, because the Bible says so. But in this particular situation, we don't have a word from God. To the best of my knowledge, God has not sent anybody a word that says, "I'm doing this." So I would encourage him to allow the opportunity for some speculation. I believe that this was sent by God. He could say something like that. Or if we look at biblical precedent, it would be easy to conclude that this was sent by God. But to just categorically make a statement, I think is presumptuous.
So those were the 6 statements that were in this book. As I was getting ready for our discussion today, I took the 6 statements and I thought, what if I turn them a little bit different direction? So I want to share these with you and with our viewers. And instead of asking, essentially, this is not the wording of his question, but essentially instead of asking, why did God send the coronavirus, to think of Romans 8:28, "In all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose," and ask, what good might God bring out of the coronavirus? And these things, especially the last couple ones here, I thought were bringing that out. But this is how I might word some of these. If I were to take these 6 things and make them an answer to the question, how might God bring good out of the coronavirus? Number 1, cause us to seek his grace. Number 2, motivate us to turn from sin. And we talked about how the kindness of God motivates us. Number 3, point us to the hope of Christ's return. Number 4, to make evident to us the surpassing worth of Christ. Number 5, to lead us to serve others with good works. And number 6, to open new possibilities for mission. And for the most part, that's saying the same things that he was saying here, but I tried to put in my own language. He had 6 things here, things that God might bring out of the coronavirus. Are there any others that he missed? Is there a 7th or 8th?
I don't know. I like your approach a lot better. Romans 8:28 is God's word. In all things, God works for good. People mistranslate that all the time, misquote it all the time. All things work together for good. That's not what it says. Not everything turns out the way we want it to turn out.
Right.
But in all things, God works for good, which means in Corona, God is going to do something good.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way you structured. Your statements are more gospel-centered.
Okay.
Different Christians approach God's word different ways. Some Christians put a greater focus on the law, and some Christians put a greater focus on the gospel. I don't mean to be disrespectful, But you can't get people to heaven by scaring the hell out of them. And we get people to heaven by telling them about the love of God. That's the gospel. And your statements reflect the gospel. The book reflects the law more. And St. Paul said the gospel is the power of God that leads to salvation, not the law. The law kills. The gospel saves.
Just so you know, I'm learning how to do a podcast style. I have a series of questions. I've only asked one of the questions that I had written down, so this is just how much fun it is to talk with Pastor Doug. Okay, so let's go to your career at USAA. I think you are one of the great stories in the history of our congregation of a surprise that God had. You were with USAA for 23 years?
23 years, yeah.
And then things changed.
If I could be awkward, I carry my Bible. And in my Bible, I've showed this to a number of people on staff. There's a picture I carry, and this is my confirmation picture. This is Pastor Don Taylor was my pastor, and I carry it in my Bible as a reminder of the influence he had on me and the influence that I can have as well. And he planted a seed when I was in 7th grade about entering the ministry. This was a time when, communication today, you can get everything online. It just didn't have that reinforcement communication. So I didn't know how about to go into the ministry. I always had a longing for it, but didn't really have anyone to kind of guide me into it. So I went off after high school. I went to Texas A&M for 2.5 years. Just wasn't the best student, so the university and I agreed it would be a good idea to kind of part ways for a while. And then I got a job here in San Antonio with a bank for about a year, and then applied at USAA. The woman who interviewed me, I happened to go to high school with her son. I would like to think I got in by my abilities, but I'm pretty sure it helped to know her. And so I got a job at USAA and worked at USAA, loved every minute that I was there. But there was always this sort of unfinished business in my life about this call that the Lord spoke through Pastor Taylor about the ministry. But again, I just didn't know how to go about pursuing that. And I was very satisfied with USAA. And thought I would always retire there until the Lord had some other plans for me in about 2001. Pastor Michael had talked to me just kind of off the cuff, casually about, would you ever consider coming on board as a staff member here? And it was sort of that full circle from Pastor Taylor in 1967, 68 to Pastor Michael in 1998, 99. It was that voice again. And I wrestled with it for a long time, for a better part of a year, thinking about doing that. And I just really felt like the Lord had opened some doors, and it didn't make sense for my seniority at USAA. It didn't make sense salary-wise, but it made sense from the Lord's perspective. And I said yes. And no sooner had I said yes than Pastor Michael received a call from a church in Colorado. And I had to make a decision. Am I a disciple of Pastor Michael, or am I a disciple of the Lord? And that became very clear for me, and I knew I was a disciple of the Lord, and came on. And for the longest time, and I'll run into some students, some alumni every once in a while, for the longest time I was Mr. B. Yep. Yeah, because I wasn't an ordained pastor. I went through colloquy program, but always had that desire to enter into the ministry, and my initial job here was to do junior and senior high youth, and then to handle the function of school ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so mom and dad, you and your sister Krista, right?
Krista.
Yeah, so the four of you growing up, and I think one of the most fascinating parts of your life, and we talked about this, is growing up in Germany during the World War II period and after. You've told me stories about the Russians and your dad's business. And, do you want to tell us just an overview of what life was like in Germany in World War II for you as someone who was, 7 years and older during
when
that
it
time?
started.
Yeah.
7 years. I was 7 years old when it started. But I want to tell you what a wonderful life we had when I was a child, up to 7 years.
Sure.
We had a huge place. We had a big house with lots of bedrooms. Always had company. My parents, each one were 7 siblings. Each one consisted of 7 siblings, and they were the youngest one. So we had a lot of get-togethers, but a lot of funerals too. So I know funerals very well.
Yeah.
And it was, the hardest thing was when I remember when we were growing up, when Germany declared war. My father was devastated. My mother was devastated. Everybody we knew was devastated. We didn't know what it was all about. Why did they declare war? Nobody knew. And so that
Nobody knew?
No, nobody knew.
What, were they told?
No,
Why?
it was just Germany declared war. We heard it. You know, you didn't have television. You had just radio.
Right.
And my father did something that he wasn't supposed to do. He listened to BBC.
Ah.
That was already established then. And you didn't hear everything on the German news because it was very censored.
Did your dad understand English?
He did speak some English, but they had a German broadcast too,
Oh, okay.
to inform the public.
Got it.
And that was good.
Okay. So everybody was confused and upset about the
it was
war.
so upset.
And then the war went on in Germany for 6 years, right? From
Till 1945.
Yeah. So what were those 6 years like for you?
At the beginning, Hitler started his power in Bavaria. He was always in Munich and in Nuremberg doing his speeches.
Mm-hmm.
He never came to the state where I was born. That was Schlesien. It's translated Silesia. It used to be Prussia and it is German. My father was born in Poland originally, but that was also very cultural diverse. There were a lot of Jews, a lot of Poles, a lot of Russians, a lot of Germans. And he spoke mostly Polish, was very fluent in Polish, Russian, and he spoke a little English from school.
Wow.
But he lived a little bit. He went to England and was in England for a while. And but he had a big, what is called a cement factory. It was a big plant. We had a huge house. We had lots of people, 7 siblings on both sides. And I remember we had an orchard, we had a vegetable garden, we had a park-like area where open with lots of benches around and trees and lilac bushes all around the compound.
Wow.
And the factory was further away, but my youth was wonderful there, wonderful. I went to, parents put me into a Lutheran school, and my sister too, in the early years, because in Germany at 10 years you have to decide what branch you go. You go on into higher education and you have to go and change schools. Well, I was 7 years when the war started. So that was the most dramatic thing that happened there. My parents didn't know why and what. And so he was able to keep his business going because it was very much in demand. Cement and building, construction was going on. Hitler promised that streets were being built. These were good things that he did. But we didn't know about anything about the Jews until my father had lots of friends that he grew up with Jews. And they moved also and opted for Germany like my father did too.
And obviously God had a different plan for you and Debbie. That plan wasn't for you to stay at the school in New Orleans, but after 1 year of ministry there, you received the call to come be principal here at the ripe old age of
24.
24 years old. as a principal of a school, which at that time was not as big as it is now. It was growing, but it was a significant responsibility. How many students in the school at the time you were called?
When we started that year, there were 41.
Okay.
And so it was a completely different environment. In fact, the building, there was the portable building where just about where we're sitting here, it was on this piece of the property, and there was the original church building, which is now down, but it had the first grade where all the offices were. There were no walls in it. The first grade was there, and my 9 students in the second and third grade combined were across the hall, and that was just the school at the time. Plus, it had childcare down in the worship center. And as you know, people would say, if I was to die, I have to be buried in a childcare, because the childcare all week was what the worship center was, and then on Saturday everything went back underneath underneath the balcony, and all of the chairs that were brought out in the altar was set up, and there was worship service on Sunday. And so it was a true multi-space use building.
Yeah, really. Now, how did you feel about being invited to come and be principal of a school at age 24? How did they locate you as a teacher? And what did you think when you received the invitation?
Well, like I said, things were in New Orleans had been rough, and we had talked with the placement director and said, how do we handle this? These really, nobody trains you to expect this to happen in a congregation. And so we had been in contact with him, and he had realized that we weren't going to be there full time and felt kind of bad about that. So he went around some of the rules that were there for placement directors. It was his job to get the first call for people out, not to work with people in the field. Yeah. But Pastor Dan called and asked if they knew of anybody who might be interested or might be available to be principal. And Dr. Rachel gave our number to him, and he called. And I remember we were sitting in New Orleans in our apartment, and Debbie got this phone call and said, "What?" And then she put her hand over the phone and handed it to me, giggling, saying, "There's a pastor from San Antonio, and he wants to know if you're interested in a call to be principal." And then she had to stand up and walk away because she was laughing. So I get lots of appreciation from her, I guess.
That's right.
But that was a true blessing from God, and a true opportunity that we had to come here, and the opportunity to be a part of this ministry. We came the first time, and Pastor Dan came to pick us up to take us to his house, and he had been barbecuing, as he often did, as found out, and watching a Spurs game when the Spurs weren't winning. And he came to pick us up in his old Bonneville, and he had Joshua in his arms, and he jumped out over the door because the door didn't open, and came walking in, and our mom was there with us, and they said, "Mom, I think that's the pastor." Well, he had his tank top and his shorts on and his sandals on and holding the baby. And she said, "It can't be." And because she grew up in a German Lutheran church where the pastor still spoke German for one of the services when we were younger. And I said, "No, I think it is." And from that moment on, we developed a really wonderful relationship with him.
And you would have gone from a situation where the people who taught you are now your colleagues.
Oh,
I mean, we've had a lot of longtime teachers. So
Yes. So I can't call any of them by their first name. So it's always Mr. or Mrs. because the first name doesn't flow very well off my tongue. I have to keep it that way. But it's real fun to be partnering with them in the ministry, and leading as they led me and others. because it obviously made an impact in my life, because I'm back here hoping to make the same impact for others.
Absolutely. So tell us a little more about your journey of life. So growing up, we talked about you were here from 3 through 8th grade, those years of life. Who were some of the biggest influences in your life, family or here or whoever it might be?
Great. Yeah. I mean, everybody here was absolutely wonderful. I never had a teacher that I didn't get along with, didn't impact me in any, they all made some important part, made me who I am today. And so that was one reason why I, wanted to be a teacher. I've always wanted to be a teacher, like from day one, I feel like, or be in education, because my mom and my aunt were teachers, and I always wanted to grade papers. And I don't know, now as being a teacher, I don't know why I ever wanted to do that. Oh, I did. My aunt taught 2nd grade, and she told me, you can't grade papers until you pass 2nd grade. So like once I passed 2nd grade, I was ready to grade papers. I don't know why. I thought that was like the best thing.
Wow.
And I, would play school all the time, but I knew I wanted to be a teacher for a long time. And then just being around wonderful teachers here, just made such an impact on that decision. One teacher that's always been fabulous is Mrs. Eichstead. She was my 2nd and 5th grade teacher.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I had her twice. And she's had Austin, and then Mackenzie's going to be in pre-K next year. So so it's kind of neat to have that generation, her teaching my kids. She was always wonderful. And then I remember Miss Gary, and she was my 8th grade math teacher. And that time she was going through school. And I just remember those math classes being kind of fun, because she was kind of busy, yet also teaching us. But like, we always had a good time in that class, in that algebra class. I'll never forget that. We would joke around, and now we can banter back and forth as adults and talk about those times. So she's really influential. And then of course, family, my mom, she's been wonderful. My dad passed away when I was young, when I went to school here. And so, being here and being in this environment, I think really helped shape myself and my brother, and just going through something that tragic, inspired us in our faith walk and just being good people, because that's who's here. It's good people. And
that it just wouldn't have worked for her to have been in the picture.
So was there a point in which you sat him down and told him that he was adopted, or was that just something that was understood growing up? How did he come to that realization?
When we got him, the very first thing I went out and bought was a plaque that I hung in his room, and it said, not flesh of my flesh, nor bone of my bone, but still miraculously my own.
Wow.
And then it had more to the point. And so I would read that to him. And then we also bought a adoption book explaining adoption. And being a big proponent of reading to children faithfully a lot, that book was read every day. So he grew up knowing adoption. And then as he got older, he questioned, okay, what does that mean really? You know? And it was, we talked about it, and then he was like, oh, okay. And he ran off and played. It was just no big deal to him.
He didn't know any other way.
He didn't know any other way.
Yeah.
And like he says today, you're my mother, not her. So. So it worked. But then I divorced in 1992. He was 6 years old.
Yeah.
And the reason why I divorced was because I was in an abusive relationship. And the day that my son walked up to me and hit me because he thought it was okay was the day I knew that I had to get him away from that, so that he would learn differently and not be taught by what he saw. So we moved to San Antonio, and it was hard. It was hard being a single mom and going through everything. I'm a girl. I don't like boy things. I don't like bugs. I don't like sports. I don't like all of this. And I was raising a boy. But we have a very good relationship. We're very close.
I hope you enjoyed that look back on some of our early episodes. We were exploring timely issues, getting to know some people who have been here for a while, some people with some great stories, a little bit of variety there for you in those early episodes. We've got one more episode of the Shepherd Podcast. It will air next week. Please join me then. Until then, the Lord's blessings to you. May He keep you healthy and safe and strong, and the peace of the Lord be with you today.